Hello, ladies and gentlemen, to my commentary. According to a report from Reuters, on the 29th of November 2025, the United States under President Donald Trump announced a complete closure of the airspace above and around Venezuela. The phrasing was unequivocal and unmistakably confrontational. The airspace would be shut down entirely, enforced by U.S. military assets already repositioned in the Caribbean. Within minutes of the announcement, global markets jolted. Flight paths redrew themselves across aviation maps, and a region already simmering in tension suddenly felt the sky drop several degrees colder. The script opens precisely at that moment of rupture. Commercial flights bound for Caracas were told to divert. Cargo planes carrying essential goods were halted mid-route, instructed to reroute through distant air corridors. Radar screens across northern South America flickered with uncertainty as pilots scrambled for alternatives. What the world witnessed was not merely a bureaucratic policy shift. It was the abrupt militarization of an entire airspace executed without warning, without phased measures, without diplomatic cushioning. Washington's official narrative struck a familiar chord. This was a necessary step to combat dangerous narcotics routes and hostile activities, allegedly operating through Venezuelan skies. The White House framed the closure as a security imperative, a move to protect American lives from what it described as criminal networks embedded inside Venezuela's political and military structure. But beneath this official line, the question thundered louder than the announcement itself. Is this truly a war on drugs or the quiet first step of a geopolitical showdown? To critics, the language of anti-drug operations sounded painfully familiar, echoing decades of U.S. interventions, cloaked in moral justifications. To analysts, the timing was unmistakable. With Venezuela's economy weakened, its government increasingly isolated, and regional alliances shifting, the sudden aerospace lockdown looked less like law enforcement and more like strategic suffocation, a deliberate tightening of the noose around Caracas. Inside Venezuela, panic spread quickly. News anchors struggled to keep pace with developments. Families with relatives abroad confronted the fear of isolation. Businesses dependent on imports braced for immediate disruption. The symbolism was devastating. The United States had not merely sanctioned Venezuela, it had sealed its skies. To understand why the U.S. airspace closure landed with such seismic force, we must rewind through the slow-burning fuse that brought Washington and Caracas to this moment. The crisis did not erupt overnight. It erupted after years pressure, miscalculations, and geopolitical maneuvering that steadily transformed a political dispute into a hemispheric fault line. The roots stretch back to a familiar battlefield, sanctions. What began as targeted measures against senior Venezuelan officials expanded methodically into a sweeping economic blockade. Oil exports were throttled. Banking channels were severed and foreign investment was chilled to near zero. Each escalation was defended as a push for democratic restoration, yet its effects were unmistakably blunt. Venezuela's economy cracked, inflation soared, and millions were driven to the brink. By 2025, the US had wielded every economic weapon, short of outright military intervention. And when sanctions failed to produce regime change, Washington pivoted to something far more visceral, physical control of Venezuela's geography. This is the stage at which the airspace closure emerges, not as a spontaneous reaction to alleged drug activity, but as the next step in a long calculated playbook. History offers chilling parallels: Iraq, Libya, the Balkans. Each time the establishment of air restrictions, a no-fly zone, and enforced perimeter An air blockade was advertised as a protective measure, but ultimately became the prelude to force inside the Pentagon. And white House planners understand this better than anyone. Airspace is not simply empty sky. It is a chessboard, a signal, a line drawn with jets instead of ink. Closing it around a sovereign nation is, in essence, a declaration that the U.S. is now prepared to dictate the rules of movement, to reshape the strategic landscape from above before anything happens on the ground. The economic impact was immediate and devastating. Airlines canceled routes indefinitely. Cargo companies froze shipments, unwilling to risk the wrath of U.S. enforcement. Aircraft patrolling the perimeter. Insurance premiums for Venezuelan-bound goods skyrocketed overnight. Ports slowed as supply chains scrambled to adapt. Even without firing a single shot, Washington had executed what one analyst called a humanitarian tourniquet, a tightening of pressure that stops the flow of economic lifeblood. Yet another dimension was at play: domestic U.S. politics. With Trump eager to project dominance abroad, Venezuela provided the perfect foil: a government already demonized in American media, a crisis that could be framed as a moral duty, an anti-drug urgency, or a national security necessity. The airspace closure wasn't just a strategic escalator. It was a political performance crafted to display strength ahead of crucial legislative battles in Washington. In the tense hours following Washington's airspace shutdown, all eyes turned to Caracas. The Venezuelan government, long accustomed to crisis, now faced something far more existential: the sudden realization that the skies above their own capital were no longer entirely their own. And so as midnight approached, the nation stood still, waiting for its leaders to speak. The camera lights snapped on. Venezuelan president appeared flanked by military commanders and cabinet officials, their faces carved in stone. His voice, measured yet quivering with controlled fury, cut through the silence. The United States had committed an act of aggression without precedent, an undeclared air blockade and a direct assault on Venezuelan sovereignty. He accused Washington of constructing a narrative of terrorism to mask a deeper ambition: the geopolitical containment and eventual subjugation of Venezuela's political order. This, he declared, was not a war on drugs. It was an independence war, a war on self-determination, a war on the right of a nation to exist without bending its knee. The response from the Venezuelan public was a mixture of fear, anger, and grim resolve. Crowds gathered in the streets of Caracas, Maracay, Valencia, and Mérida. Some carried flags, others signs reading "No Más Bloyo," and sovereignty is not negotiable. But beneath the chants and patriotic speeches lay something much deeper and far more volatile: a growing sense that the crisis had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Within military barracks and command centers, tension spiked. Radar operators monitored the perimeter with trembling focus. Fighter jets were placed on standby. Anti-air batteries received updated protocols. Venezuela's armed forces knew the stakes: any misidentification, any aggressive interception, any aircraft wandering too close to the new U.S.-defined perimeter could ignite a confrontation within seconds. Behind closed doors, the internal debate was fierce. The hardliners demanded a show of strength, scramble the jets, conduct air patrols, declare a counter zone, even consider escorting foreign aircraft willing to defy the blockade. To them, yielding meant national humiliation and perhaps collapse. But the moderates, equally patriotic yet painfully aware of the realities of power urged caution. A direct military challenge to the United States could trigger a conflict that Venezuela had neither the resources nor the international backing to survive. Their fear was not cowardice. It was realism. A nation struggling with economic strain could not withstand the devastation of a full-scale confrontation. Meanwhile, ordinary Venezuelans faced more immediate anxieties. Families feared that the air blockade would further restrict access to medicine, food imports, and international aid. Students studying abroad panicked as flights evaporated. Business owners braced for supply chains to break again, this time not from sanctions, but from physical isolation. Still, the symbolism cut deepest of all. Venezuela was no longer merely sanctioned or pressured. It was encircled. The sky, the most basic symbol of freedom, movement, and national pride, had become a reminder of their vulnerability. The shock waves of Washington's airspace closure did not stop at Venezuela's borders. They traveled outward through Latin American capitals, through global markets, through military alliances, forcing governments around the world to pick a side in a crisis that suddenly felt larger than the hemisphere itself. The first responses came from Venezuela's closest economic partners, who were caught off guard but not surprised. They condemned the U.S. action as dangerous overreach, unilateral imposition that violated international aviation norms and flirted with the logic of siege warfare. Their statements were sharp, unusually so, signaling that this was not just another sanction, not another diplomatic quarrel. This was a fundamental shift in the rules of power for these nations. The closure of Venezuelan airspace did more than threaten trade. It threatened the principle of sovereignty. If a superpower could effectively seal the skies around another country without unauthorization, what would stop it from doing the same elsewhere? The geopolitical fear was clear. Today, Venezuela; tomorrow, anyone deemed inconvenient. In Latin America, the divide was immediate and visceral. Some governments aligned politically with the Washington offered cautious approval. They echoed us talking points, citing drug trafficking routes, regional instability, and the need for extraordinary measures. But even these, governments tread carefully, aware that public sentiment in their own countries is heavily opposed to foreign intervention. Others reacted with unfiltered fury. They accused the United States of resurrecting an old colonial reflex, treating the region as a strategic backyard rather than a community of sovereign nations. For them, the airspace closure was a red line reminiscent of darker decades, marked by coups, covert operations, and great power manipulation. Their messages were unwavering. This action risked igniting a conflict the entire continent would pay for. Beyond the region, major global powers stepped into the fray. Their reactions were calculated but unmistakably defiant. They criticized the move as destabilizing, provocative, and legally indefensible. Behind closed doors, diplomatic channels buzzed as these nations discussed joint strategies to respond, whether through UN debates, economic cooperation with Venezuela, or visible military activities nearby that signaled they were watching. The United Nations quickly became the stage for the next act. Emergency meetings were called. Delegates clashed over the legality of Washington's decision. Was this a protective measure under international law, or was it a coercive act verging on a blockade, something that required Security Council approval? Lawyers dissected precedents from Iraq, Libya, and Kosovo, searching for parallels, warnings, and loopholes. But the UN chamber quickly revealed a deeper truth. The global order was fracturing. Where once consensus might have prevailed, now the world saw polarization, mistrust, and competing visions of what power should look like, and Venezuela's sealed sky became the symbolic battlefield for this clash of worldviews. Meanwhile, military analysts warned that the situation had reached a precarious threshold with U.S. aircraft patrolling the perimeter and Venezuelan defenses on heightened alert. The risk of miscalculation was enormous. A civilian plane was misidentified. A surveillance drone is straying too close. A warning shot was fired in panic. Any spark could ignite a geopolitical chain reaction. As the world watched the crisis unfold, one question became impossible to ignore. What exactly was the United States trying to achieve? The official narrative broadcast relentlessly from the White House was crisp and forceful. President Trump framed the airspace closure as a decisive strike against narcotics trafficking, a bold move to cut off a dangerous aerial corridors used by criminal networks operating with the alleged complicity from Venezuelan authorities. To his supporters, this was a triumphant display of strength. A president taking action where others had hesitated, a commander and chief securing borders from an external threat. But beneath the surface of this clean, patriotic messaging lay layers far more complicated and far more perilous. Because while Washington spoke the language of law enforcement, the mechanics of its action resembled something very different. A coercive geopolitical maneuver designed to shift regional power balances, not drug routes. The closure of an entire nation's surrounding airspace is not a policing tactic. It is a strategic declaration, one that redefines the physical and political landscape with a single stroke. For critics, the contradiction was glaring. If narcotics trafficking were the primary concern, cooperation between governments, multilateral monitoring, and targeted interdictions would have sufficed. But instead, Washington chose the most maximalist option available, a move that isolates a nation, a move that pressures its economy, a move that intentionally or not places the Venezuelan government in a chokehold. This raised the specter of something darker, regime pressure disguised as moral urgency inside Venezuela. That interpretation became the dominant narrative. Officials described the airspace shutdown as part of a long-standing U.S. ambition to reshape Latin America's political map, to punish governments that refuse to align, to reward those that do, and to remind every leader in the region of Washington's unrivaled reach. The crisis, they argued, was not about drugs nor danger. It was about shaping the hemisphere's destiny from the skies down. International analysts echoed these fears. Many pointed out that airspace control has historically been the first stage of intervention, establishing strategic superiority long before ground operations begin. Others warned that the air blockade would worsen humanitarian conditions, strangling supply chains and pushing ordinary Venezuelans deeper into hardship, a slow, suffocating pressure without a single shot fired. Yet the most alarming possibilities still lie ahead. Diplomats from neutral nations warned quietly of three plausible scenarios. Scenario one, controlled de-escalation. Both sides step back from the brink. Dialogue begins behind closed doors. Air restrictions loosen in exchange for limited monitoring agreements. It is the path of reason, but also the path requiring rare political humility. Scenario two, prolonged standoff. The airspace closure becomes semi-permanent. Venezuela adapts but bleeds. The U.S. maintains pressure without advancing or retreating. The crisis calcifies into a geopolitical stalemate with no off-ramp. Scenario three, escalation to conflict, a misread radar signature, a drone crossing an invisible line, a warning shot turned into a deadly exchange. Within minutes, the hemisphere is plunged into a conflict neither side was ready for, but both could be trapped inside. As the world weighs these futures, one truth rises above all others. Large powers rarely make symbolic moves. The sky was closed for a reason, one not yet fully revealed, but undeniably intentional. And so this five-part story ends with a question as chilling as it is unresolved. Is the United States fighting cartels in the clouds above Venezuela, or is it shaping the battlefield for the next chapter of geopolitical dominance? The sky is sealed, the region is on edge, and the world holds its breath for what comes next. Thank you for watching.